try to make this available. There it is. We'll try to make this available to everybody via email link as a follow-up. So if you wanted to share this with others or go back and watch it, feel free to do so. I'm assuming that most of you are pretty familiar with how to operate Zoom, but maybe as a reminder or refresher, if you could mute yourself until the end, we will have about 25 minutes or so for question and answer at the end where you can unmute and ask questions. But in the meantime, if you don't mind muting yourself, that would be helpful. A couple of ways that you can communicate with us as needed is there's a chat function down at the bottom of your screen. You should see a toolbar. Sometimes if you're not on it, it won't highlight. Depends on how you have it set up. You can chat with us just like a text message would. You can also chat with individuals that are in the meeting today. So if you don't want to text everybody, you can find drop-down items, options for you there. As I mentioned, we will also have a question and answer session in the second half of today's meeting. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to answer any questions. And then if you do want to ask a question, if you could hold it till the end of the meeting in that Q&A session. If you have a clarifying question that's a real quick and easy one, you can put it in the chat and one of us will try to address it for you there. And if you're trying to get our attention during the Q&A and you want to ask a question, you can simply raise your hand like this, or there's also the ability to do that virtually with the reactions button at the bottom. So with that, before we move into our agenda, I did want to just thank some of our working team here, two of which are not with us this afternoon. Trevor Fitzpatrick is a person that really was instrumental in starting this dune restoration manual as a summer research intern with our University of Hawaii Sea Grant program about 3 years ago. And then also Colin Lee, who's also a faculty member here at the University of Hawaii now, was a law student at the time here at UH, helped us with a kind of a follow-on to that initial draft. So this has been through multiple drafts, as you might expect. And I just wanted to acknowledge some of those research fellows that had worked with us over the last couple of years. Maybe Wes, if you could do the next slide, I'll introduce the agenda here. So here's our agenda. It's real simple. We're getting through introductions now. We've got through our housekeeping items. We're going to hear from Wes Kreil here in a second on an overview of the Dune manual. So you're going to hear what's in it and some of the major components of it. We're going to break into kind of a tag team presentation very quickly. Each of us are going to present a case study of dune restoration around the state. So that'll be a quick introduction to some examples. And then we'll go out into Q&A. More than likely, we'll have a little less than 25 minutes, but we're shooting for 25 minutes. Next slide, please, Wes. All right, so this is our University of Hawaii Sea Grant team that had worked on this manual. Tara Owens in the upper left there, she's from the island of Maui. If you're from Maui, I'm sure you probably know Tara and Wes. They work closely together as our kind of a dune specialist, coastal restoration, coastal process specialist. Ruby Papp from the island of Kauai, she's with us here tonight, and she'll be our host and facilitator for the Q&A at the end. She's a coastal land use specialist working with us here at the University of Hawaii Sea Grant. Myself, Dolan Eversole, I actually focus on Waikiki, but I have interests in areas outside of Waikiki as well. Amy Wirtz is also with us here tonight, and she is working in close partnership with the Department of Land and Natural Resources Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. So we maybe can direct questions that are specific to that office to her as needed. And Brad Romine, who's not with us here today, but was an instrumental part of our review team on the Dune manual. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for joining us tonight. And we're looking forward to having an open discussion with you. And with that, I will hand off to our Wes Kreil, and he's going to introduce the Dune manual to you all.
Great, thanks, Dolan. Real quick, I wanted to just say before I dive into the content of the manual that we put the Sea Grant team folks up here because this manual is intended to work in conjunction with the Sea Grant Extension faculty. So we are here as a resource for your dune restoration projects. The manual and the extension faculty go hand in hand. So just wanted to reiterate that. Like Dolan said, my name is Wes Kreil. I'm the Coastal Dune Restoration Specialist for Sea Grant. I'm based on Maui, but I support projects statewide. So if you ever want to talk dunes, please reach out. All right, let's jump right into it. In the interest of time, the Dune manual is divided into the following chapters. We start with basically an overview of the really unique coastal environment and processes that are found in the Hawaiian Islands. It talks about the importance of dunes. It then moves on to specific dune management practices or restoration tools that we utilize when doing dune restoration. And then an overview of the steps to planning and implementing a dune project. And it's important to note that while they are arranged kind of sequentially or in a stepwise fashion in the manual, in reality, they happen concurrently. So then finally, there's a chapter on ongoing monitoring and maintenance of a restoration site and a summary. We've also got some useful documents in the appendices. We've got, again, the Sea Grant contacts, for each of the islands, the coastal and regulatory agency contacts. We've got a pretty extensive list of native plants and, where they belong in a dune restoration project. And then a list of nurseries as well, as far as for help in sourcing some of that plant material. There's also a Department of Land and Natural Resources dune management fact sheet and a case study from the Kailua Beach dune restoration plan. So real quick, to lay the foundation, why are dunes important? If you look at the little graphic over to the left here, you can see, this is a normal beach profile with a nice wide beach and relatively calm ocean waves, and we have healthy dunes along the coastline here. And then you get a large wave event, such as we just had with that very large south swell recently, and those waves can really erode into the dunes a little bit and chew into the dunes and erode the shoreline. But the dunes are there as a stockpile of sand that can then be released down to the beach and replenish the beach with sand. So it's we sometimes refer to the dunes as a bank account or a stockpile of sacrificial sand that can replenish the beach, following a storm event. Dunes are also an alternative to shoreline hardening. They provide really important habitat for native plants and animals, and they provide natural protection for coastal infrastructure in the form of a big sand berm out in front of those infrastructure components. Up in the top here, you can kind of see what happens when you have degraded dunes or no dunes at all. You can get severe shoreline erosion where the chunks of the shoreline just cleave off like that, versus this nice healthy dune picture on the upper right, where we have lots of vegetation stabilizing that stockpile of sand. So moving on, what is dune restoration? Our working definition is dune restoration is working with natural coastal processes to rehabilitate or reestablish healthy dune ecosystems by encouraging sand accumulation and preventing erosion by planting native plants. So we like to say that it's equal parts science and art. It's a little bit of landscape architecture, a little bit of coastal processes science, and a little bit of gardening, essentially. So it involves utilizing plants that are well adapted to this environment. One distinction I did want to make is that there's a difference between beach nourishment, also known as beach restoration, and dune restoration. Beach nourishment involves bringing sand from an outside source, such as offshore, where it may be pumped up onto the beach, and that sand is placed on the active beach. When we refer to the active beach, what that means is the wet part of the beach, where the waves regularly wash in and out. So beach nourishment, beach restoration is beyond the scope of this manual. Dune restoration, on the other hand, is conducted further Mauka, above the high wash of waves, and it generally involves minimal movement of sand, or doesn't even have to involve moving sand at all. So what are some of the dune management practices? What are the tools in our restoration toolkit? First on our list is managing foot traffic. How people access the beach is very important to any restoration project. You can kind of see what happens over here on the right when there's unmanaged foot traffic. You have this spider web of pathways all over the shoreline that many of these are redundant, going to the same place, and probably a lot of them are not necessary. And so when we designate walkways, we take some of that foot traffic off of the dunes. And when that impact of trampling is removed, oftentimes native dune plants will just sprout up on their own. It doesn't even, you can take a passive approach, and those native seeds are still there and viable underneath the soil. And when you remove that pressure, they can come back. Important to note that when we delineate pathways, you can see them in this picture up here. They are at a slight angle, and that's because dune pathways need to be aligned perpendicular to the prevailing winds. And that's so that we don't get, if we have wind-blown sand blowing down the beach here, it doesn't turn Malca and take that sand off of the beach, like you see in this bottom picture here, where it blows off the beach and is lost to the beach system. So next in our toolkit, after we've established the pathways and we've made sure that people can access the beach, we designate the dune restoration areas. This is done, with simple posts and rope. Doesn't have to be fancy. You can use wooden fencing or any natural material to kind of match the local aesthetic of the area. The idea is, again, just to designate the restoration areas. Really important that we do outreach and put up signage whenever we do dune restoration, because we don't want to give the impression that we're limiting beach access, even the perception that we might be limiting beach access, because access to the ocean, access to the beach is protected by state law. And, the last thing we want to do is limit people's ability to access the shoreline. We want to enhance that, designate it, and then designate restoration areas as well. So ongoing signage and outreach. The next tool in our toolkit is to remove obstructions and invasive species. And when I'm talking about obstructions in this case, it's anything that impedes the natural flow of wind, sand, and waves within a shoreline area. Dunes are very dynamic systems. The sand moves back and forth, the sand comes and goes. And so when you place obstructions like old buildings or building material or concrete or some sort of rubble in the way, it can impede that natural flow of sand. Especially in severely eroding parts of the shoreline, you get all kinds of strange things washing out of the dunes. So old irrigation pipes and construction debris, all kinds of stuff. So we remove those obstructions. Another obstruction I wanted to highlight is a little counterintuitive sometimes, but it's in the form of vegetation encroachment or invasive vegetation that's growing too close to the ocean. You can see up here in this upper right-hand picture, these are ironwood trees that are growing right up to the ocean's edge. And in this case, they're falling out of as the shoreline erodes, the ironwoods are falling onto the beach and creating this hazard of stumps and things. This picture over here on the left is this is Naupaka, which Naupaka is an interesting case. While it is a native plant, and we do utilize native plants in our restoration, Naupaka we have to be careful with, because if Naupaka is placed too close to the front of the dunes, and if it's overwatered, which often happens in areas when a dune is adjacent to a landscaped area, like in front of a hotel or a resort or even a homeowner, a beachfront homeowner, that Naupaka can get overwatered and really grow too tall, and then actually creep down the beach and encroach and impede access. So our next tool in the toolkit is to plant native vegetation. And again, in this case, we sometimes refer to native vegetation as nature's rebar and concrete. And these plants are so well adapted to their environment that we give them the most valuable plant award, which goes to two plants, Pahui Hui and Aki Aki grass. And this is Pahui Hui over here, or beach morning glory, and it's a vine that trails along the shoreline. And then Aki Aki grass, this one here. They're both native plants. They're both really well adapted to the harsh coastal environments, and they're both really good at holding sand and helping it accumulate. You can see over here in this picture, these heart-shaped leaves of the Pahui Hui act like little cups or funnels. And when wind-blown sand is blowing down the beach and it encounters a Pahui Hui vine, that sand can accumulate and build up over time. And it's really amazing how fast that can happen with just the presence of plants there to impede that wind-blown sand. These plants can also recover really quickly after a storm. They can be buried, they can be splashed with salt water, and they bounce back really quickly. So they're really great plants for the frontal part of a dune closest to the ocean. So these next tools in our toolkit are considered optional. You don't have to do them to have a successful dune restoration project, but we included them because they can often enhance depending on the site where how quickly the dunes accumulate, or how quickly the sand accumulates in a dune. So sand fencing does the same thing as Pahui Hui and Aki Aki grass, but it works a little bit quicker sometimes. And the way it works is you install this fencing perpendicular to the prevailing winds, and then as the wind-blown sand hits it, it falls out and starts to accumulate over time. So it can kind of kickstart a dune project and build up sand rapidly. Some of the trade-offs with using sand fencing is it has to be maintained, or it starts to kind of look a little ratty over time, and then eventually it has to be removed or it'll be buried. Along the same lines, we sometimes can rebuild sand dunes. So this can be done simply by pushing sand into a pile and planting it with native vegetation. You can see this picture up here. You can use equipment to skim the top, say 6 to 8 inches of sand from the active beach, push it up the beach into a berm, and then stabilize that berm with vegetation. Sand could also be sourced from nearby. For example, in some areas there are stream mouths that have a sand plug in them, and in a lot of cases that sand plug is removed to facilitate flooding or to prevent flooding of the surrounding area. And so a good use of that sand would be a dune restoration project in the immediate vicinity. Also, sometimes you get sand that accumulates in a parking lot or on a road, gets blown off the beach. It's really appropriate to put that precious resource that is our beach sand back into the system, and building dunes can be an appropriate use of that sand. The final tool in our toolkit, we'd already talked about beach access and delineating pathways, but in some cases that comes in the form of an elevated boardwalk. And this could be really useful in areas of heavy foot traffic where you have a lot of people accessing the beach. It's a way to get people up and over the dune without even walking in it, so without causing any trampling at all. It has a minimal footprint within the dunes, and some considerations with dune walkovers are they generally, if they're in a public area, they have to be Americans with Disabilities Act compliant, which just is a series of parameters that says from the handicap parking place in a parking lot, the slope of an access pathway can only be a certain ratio. And so it generally takes pretty advanced carpentry skills or a knowledgeable contractor to do that sort of thing. But that said, there have been several ADA compliant boardwalks built by community groups and volunteer organizations. So those are, in a nutshell, the restoration tools that we use. I'm just going to go into the planning and implementation steps now. And again, keeping in mind that these are arranged sequentially, but they tend to happen concurrently in reality. So the first step of the planning implementation phase is to kilo or observe a site. Really understand the local conditions. You can do this with your friendly Sea Grant extension faculty, and understand the coastal processes as well as you can. Which way is the wind coming from? Which way do the currents go? Are there big seasonal shifts? I know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the beaches in Hawaii. During the summer months, you'll have a broad, huge beach, and then the first winter swell comes along, and all of a sudden, it's like, what happened to the beach? It disappears. So those are seasonal variations that happen, and you really need to be aware of those for when you're planning a dune restoration project. Restoration projects generally come, we extension faculty work within the county planning departments. And I saw Jim Buca on here, so he's with the Maui County Planning Department. But sometimes a dune restoration project comes about because of a permit that comes through the department, or from an interested community member, or it can come from, maybe there's a problem. Maybe someone is noticing erosion and they're wondering, oh, is dune restoration a potential solution for this problem? Is there something we can do to mitigate this particular problem? So we work with community groups, nonprofits, shoreline property owners, really anyone interested in restoring dunes. So once you've done a lot of helo observation, at the same time, you can be identifying and engaging the potential stakeholders. So who are the primary users of this beach? Are they fishermen? Are they, kite surfers, snorkelers, swimmers, all of the above? Really get a good understanding of who's using the beach. And this can be a great time also to reach out to cultural representatives. Are there traditional Hawaiian cultural practitioners that utilize this area? And maybe lineal descendants that know a lot about this particular area. It's also really good to work with the Aha Moku councils. The Mokus are the traditional Hawaiian governance districts, and every part of the state has a Moku. And so find out what Moku a potential restoration project is in. What Moku is it in? And then you can find the Aha Moku Council representative for that area. Also good to work with community members, those longtime residents that have walked that stretch of beach for every day for 20, 30, 40 years. They can be a real wealth of knowledge that can help guide, how this restoration project looks. And of course, it's always good to, at this point, to reach out to the different permitting agencies at the state and county levels. So the next step, after lots of community outreach and observation, is to develop a site plan. A site plan can be very detailed, can be akin to architectural blueprints or landscape design plans, or it can be as simple as a Google Earth image like this with areas delineated. It shows the restoration areas. It shows the pathways, prominent features such as streams or other structures. And a site plan is great because it also provides something to share with your stakeholders. It's a great tool for that engagement. So you can share that with them and get feedback and try to incorporate feedback into the design. It's also the basis for any and all permits that you'll have to apply for. At the state level, you need a site plan approval generally, and can't have a site plan approval without a site plan. So it's very important. And it's also on the county side, a special management area permit, an SMA permit, will require a site plan. So step number 4 is probably pretty self-explanatory, but once you've got the plan, it's time to implement it. This is where all that outreach and engagement with local stakeholders in the community can come in really handy, because we've used a lot of volunteer labor to do the actual work, do the planting within these restoration projects. You can, of course, hire contractors as well, or do a combination of both. But it's really important to continue the outreach during the implementation stages as well, so that everybody in the community knows what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's important. And then finally, the final step, monitoring and maintenance. So dune restoration sites generally don't have a huge maintenance burden. We dune plants, like I was saying, the puhui and the aki are very drought tolerant, so they can they don't need a lot to once they're established. We use a little bit of drip irrigation for the first 2 to 3 months, just to get them established. Once they're growing, you can turn off the water and remove that irrigation, and they'll do fine. Other maintenance activities involve replacing posts and rope as it degrades, making sure the signage is up to date, up to snuff, and looks good, and then making sure that your pathways that you've designated are being utilized, and that people are getting the message as to where how they're supposed to access the beach. As far as monitoring for success of these projects, the most simple that we use almost all the time is just simple photographic documentation. We can do a before, during, and after picture like this, where you can see the site conditions and see how they change. Is there an increase of native plant cover? Is there more diversity of native plants? Is there a reduction in flooding? With an increased sand berm here, there's less likelihood that waves are going to overwash the dunes and wash into the backshore area. Another indicator could be increases in cultural uses, increases in shoreline access for traditional practices. And of course, this one here, I think I saw Heidi on the call. She knows all about topographic monitoring as a surveyor, but doing a simple survey can show the accumulation of sand over time. How quickly have those dunes grown and how tall are they? So those are ways to monitor the success of a restoration site. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dolan. We're gonna share some case studies now, some examples from around the state. So Dolan's going to take us through our first case study.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. Great job introducing the manual. Hopefully everybody got a sense for what's in it if you haven't seen it already. If you check your chat, the chat box, there should be a link to the digital document if you haven't seen it yet. I would encourage you to take a look at it and download it if you like. I'm going to be introducing the case study here at Sunset Beach. That's located on the north shore of the island of Oahu. You can see that's the kind of the upper star. Well, I don't have to explain where Sunset Beach is, do I? Wes, if you could go to the next slide, please. There we go. This is Sunset Beach, subject to pretty severe erosion the last 5 years. And it's been an ongoing battle with both foot traffic erosion and coastal erosion here due to high wave action and erosional events that occur every 10 or 15 years. The most recent one was in 2017 and 18, which caused this erosion here you see in the left image, where the bike path was undermined and subsequently relocated landward. And that resulted in community engagement with the city and county of Honolulu. This is a city beach park. So this is this particular project was entirely in the public domain in a beach park that's heavily used and heavily impacted by foot traffic erosion, actually. And this was a result of a severe erosion event due to high surf, but it more importantly resulted in the community wanting to do something about the dune there and working through, navigating through kind of the government channels. The North Shore Community Land Trust was able to obtain permission from the city to try a demonstration project to see if a dune restoration would even be feasible here. Nobody had tried to do this in this location, so this was the first ever. And the image on the right there is kind of after the initial slug of sand was moved and plantings were put in place. You can see that there is vegetation intact. And this project was really about prioritizing protection of coastal access, public access to and along the shoreline here. And the walkway was relocated in a part, but there was another section of this particular bike path that remains in place and was severely threatened with erosion, among other problems. It had a drop off, an elevation problem from the edge of the walkway to the top of the beach, varied depending on how much foot traffic erosion it got, but a couple feet. to even 2 or 3 feet at times, which is can be dangerous if you're riding a bike at night, something like that. Next slide. So the process of removing the walkway and the bike path presented an opportunity to replace what was a bike path with a dune. And in order to do that, some sand needed to be restored. And somebody had asked earlier in our meeting about where did the sand come from? Great question. In this case, the sand was just simply relocated from immediately Mackay of the property of the project site and just pushed landward and reshaped into a dune. It was not brought in from other locations, nor was it really brought in from the sides too much. Primarily just push the sand straight up the beach, which is commonly done by the city in order to keep the elevation of the beach close to the top of the walkway here. They would typically do this once a year. There was some walkways installed, access points, and then you can see some of these images, the plantings, and of course the dune fencing. And I can't highlight enough how critical the dune fencing was to the success of this project, which allowed the vegetation an opportunity to establish itself without being trampled by thousands of people that visit this beach park on a daily basis. So in the lower left side of the slide there, you can see kind of the more recent photos of what it looks like now with fairly well-established vegetation, pahui and alpaca primarily, but there was a variety of plant species intentionally planted in here as a diverse set of plants. And next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the takeaways from this particular project. Some of the opportunities that were realized here is having the community support was really key for obvious reasons, but some that may not be so obvious is this was entirely built with volunteer labor. The city allowed access, and that was about it. They were, an active participant and partner, but didn't really provide, other than the sand pushing, didn't really provide a whole lot of hands-on. There was a huge reduction in liability for the city in really restoring the elevation up against the bike path so that there isn't this big drop off anymore. And that was primarily done through the sand push, but then by establishing the dune vegetation and the fencing, that dune elevation was able to remain in place. And it's been there for 3 years now, whereas normally the city would have pushed sand at least 3 times, if not more frequently, to try to reshape that dune to counter all that foot traffic erosion. There's the obvious opportunity to protect the bike path and the state highway that is adjacent to it, just Mauka of the bike path. And then, as I mentioned, the reduced cost of sand pushing. The city didn't have to push sand other than just around the beach right-of-ways. Some of the challenges here, obviously extreme wave exposure and heavy foot traffic erosion. I'm not exaggerating when I say there's thousands of people that visit this site every day, even more than that sometimes in the wintertime when the surf is up, visitors. Restricting access, you're going to see a theme here, as always controversial, getting people to park their cars and then maybe go down a access way rather than just wherever they please. Took a little doing. People were disassembling the fence and things like that, but it just took constant maintenance. And now those problems have seemed to largely have gone away because people have gotten used to the fact that it's there. And that obviously leads to this idea of continual maintenance is something, if you do a project like this, you should just build into the plan to have continual maintenance beyond just landscaping, but fencing or whatever it may be. So I will stop there. I do want to acknowledge some of the partners in this project. North Shore Community Land Trust was the lead on it. They did all the heavy lifting, obtaining the permits and all the materials to do this and the labor. And then the DLNR and the city and county were obviously partners in reviewing the proposed landscape plan. World Surf League provided some funding for the vegetation. And then our Hawaii Sea Grant, we were involved with assisting however we could, as well as the outdoor circle and getting the word out. So I'll stop there and move on to our next case study.
Aloha, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening on a Monday. I am going to share our second case study, which takes us to the South Maui Kihei area at Kamaole 1 Beach Park. Our goal here is to share a few different cases in case you are thinking about a challenge in your area or a site you have in mind. So this gives you some different flavors of how these projects happen. This case here is one where many different groups, so we had various county departments, Sea Grant, and a group of volunteers, as was in Dolan's case, that partnered to carry out this dune restoration project by beneficially using beach sand that was dredged from about 1 mile down the coast from the Kihei boat ramp, which is a small harbor that's managed by the state. If Wes can help me out here, I would like to point out some of the dune restoration area and the components. Wes actually showed this image earlier, so he pointed out some of the elements such as the dune pathways, which are really critical, and the native plants that were existing and or added to the system. I also want to point out some of the public infrastructure that's getting a protective benefit from having healthy dunes. So we have there a comfort station Wes is pointing to. There's also a wastewater or sewer pump station. And behind that, there is South Kihei Road, which is a critical thoroughfare from one part of Kihei to the other. Okay, next slide, please, Wes. This is a series of photos that shows the stages of the project. So up in the top left, it's hard to see from this photo angle, but there is a large gap in the dune fronting just right in front of the wastewater pump station. And then there are other sort of flattened or low areas where foot traffic has been very heavy through this well-used and well-loved beach park. So in the top, on the right-hand side, you can see sand placement when the dredged sand from the Kihei boat ramp was transferred to this location and placed within the dune area. Then in the bottom left is another view of the sand placement directly fronting the wastewater pump station. So now we're again looking to use natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions to protect the infrastructure. And finally, in the bottom right, this is showing the reestablishment of native dune plants. So next slide, please. In terms of opportunities, there has been a long-standing dune restoration program in South Maui. So for this area, this was not a new idea, and folks generally knew what to expect. So that worked to our advantage. We were also able to take advantage of dredged sand and keep it here in this region and in this beach system, which is really important so that we're not losing sand from our beaches and contributing to erosion. And there were multiple resilience outcomes here. So not only were we benefiting the ecosystem itself, but the ecosystem is now able to provide a natural buffer for the critical infrastructure. However, as with any project, there's also a lot of behind the scenes work that goes on to connect the dots that enable a project like this to happen. And there are always challenges. Here, there was and continues to be lack of pre-planning for some of these regular dredging projects that occur within these harbors that contain beach quality sand. And so this is something we know we need to work on. And because of that, it meant that quick funding was needed at the time to be able to take advantage of what was going on. And as you guys probably know, the county and state budgets aren't really set up to be quickly adaptable to something like this. But we managed to make it work because of good interest and good partners. And then finally, while permits are really, really important for every project on the shoreline to ensure that best management practices are followed, this project and others like it require several different county permits for a project that's considered environmentally beneficial. And this is something I've heard over and over from other environmental groups who are doing beneficial projects like coral restoration, educational signage, and rain gardens, that the permitting can be a challenge or a barrier. And again, many thanks to the partners on this project, which included the South Maui volunteers and many different folks and many different departments from the County of Maui. And I'm going to pass it to Ruby next to talk about a project on Kauai.
Okay, the next case is an example of passive restoration at Salt Pond Beach Park in Hanapepe, Kauai. This area is home to a very important Hawaiian salt making area. Actually farms salt in the back there, Wes, if you can point that out. And the salt makers used their observation over time to observe that the use of vehicles on the beach by community members and tourists had grown over time and was deflating the dune. That's that area shown in red. Although this activity is already illegal, it had continued for a long time unenforced. This dune had historically protected the pond from large waves during the summer when they are making salt and the pond needs to stay dry. But as the dune deflated, they had more wave run up directly into the pond, cutting that salt making season short. So the Hui Hana Pa'akai, the salt makers Hui, took action by holding several meetings with the Hanapepe community and the county who managed the park. And as a result of all the community work that they did, which was a lot of heavy lifting, the Hui gained the blessing of the community to place boulders to restrict vehicles from driving on the beach. And you can go to the next slide, Wes. And so, as you know, although the activity was already illegal, it was necessary for the community to sort of come together to understand the impacts, because it just hadn't been enforced, and to come to acceptance on what was important to preserve and restore the beach. So as a result of just simply restricting that vehicular access, the beach and dune has slowly recovered, as shown here in the pictures. A kuli kai, a native dune plant, has begun to reestablish itself. And the salt making season this year has probably been saved by that growing dune. During the big July south swell, while waves did run up into the pond, the salt making area was spared from flooding. So we can go to the next slide. So the major pluses from this example, or opportunities to note, is that this was completely community driven and community accepted by the salt makers. They did an amazing job, and very little funds, really no funding was required besides people's time and effort, and no permits were required. Again, there were multiple resilience outcomes in terms of the ecosystem and cultural resources preservation. The challenges here are that it's obviously a longer timeline to see results, because they're not actually planting vegetation, etc. And the big one was addressing that beach driving culture that had grown over time, and it needed to be delicately handled in the community. And the Hui Hana Pa'akai did an amazing job of working with the community on this, along with the Hanapepe Elieli Community Association and the County of Kauai, who ultimately did place the boulders and restrict access onto the beach. And I will hand it back to Wes for case 4.
All right, thanks, Ruby. Last case study on this whirlwind tour of dune restoration projects takes us back to Maui. This is the Kapukaʻulua Dune Restoration Project. This is on the north shore of Maui. To get your bearings, this is the Paia Youth and Cultural Center right here. This is Lower Paia Park. This is Baldwin Beach Park. And it's important to note that this is an example of a very intensive community-led outreach and planning effort, which resulted in a large-scale shovel-ready project that will actively restore and manage almost a whole mile of coastline. So from Baobao Point, also known as Baby Beach, all the way to Lower Paia Park. It's important to note that this was a planning effort. And so we're looking, we just received funding to do the implementation stages of this project, and that'll happen over the next 3 to 4 years. So the focus of this project was really on that community outreach and engagement. It's a common theme with all these restoration projects that getting the community on board is so essential to the overall success. So we had over a year and a half worth of outreach. We formed the Kapuka Ulua Advisory Group, consisting of about 25 different members from all different, everybody from just local community members and fishermen to state and local agencies, community groups. We had 2 formal advisory group meetings, 3 informal talk story Zoom sessions. This was during the pandemic, so we were kind of limited in our in-person outreach. We had a member survey. We had the Ahamoku come and visit the site later in the grant or in the planning period, and then we even had students interview some of the key stakeholders. And all of the feedback that we got, we tried to summarize into these guiding principles for our dune restoration project. And I'm not going to read them all, but there were basic things like, protect cultural resources in the area. There were known archaeological sites and iwi kupuna in the area, so make sure that we protect them. Make the beach safe. Remove some of that rubble and those dangerous tree stumps and ironwood trees that have fallen onto the beach. No sand from the land. This was in reference to the community wanting to not bring in sand from an outside source. That was very important to this project. So we made sure to incorporate that. And we incorporated all of that feedback into these site restoration plans. This is just an example of one of them at the Paia Youth and Cultural Center, and you can see the different areas. We're going to remove some old walls and debris, create some pathways, and restore the dunes. The key takeaways for this case study were community support. We were lucky in that there was already community support for dune restoration in this area. This project followed on the back of a park master plan for the area, and so during that process, dune restoration was identified as something that had a lot of community support. It was a great chance to manage a long stretch of severely eroding coastline and manage it in a holistic manner. And again, a chance to remove that dangerous debris and make the beach more safe. And because this is such a large project and we're doing it over a long period of time, our hope is that this will create a gold standard of a restoration project with lessons learned that can be shared throughout the state. Some of the challenges, of course, addressing the cultural concerns. We had to have many different pathways to make sure that we were protecting those iwi kupuna and different options for moving sand around if we were going to do any of that at all. Differentiating between the dune restoration plan and the parks master plan. The parks were concerned with bathrooms and parking and things like that, and we were focused more on beach pathways and access. Incorporating the feedback from so many different stakeholders is challenging at times, wrangling all of that feedback into a concise way. And of course, the multiple state and county permits required. Real quick, just wanted to acknowledge all the 25 members of the Kapuka Ulua Dune Restoration Advisory Group. They were without their help and their participation, this project wouldn't have been a success. The County of Maui Parks Department was a great partner in this, and of course the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation as the funder. All right, and I'll turn it back to Ruby for questions and answers.
Yes, so I will just be facilitating. We have about 10 minutes till the end, and we're happy to stay on a little bit longer if folks need. What I'd like you to do, if you can, is you can either type your question in the chat, or you can just raise your hand using the reactions tab at the bottom right. There's a button for raising your hand. So if anyone has a question, you can do that. Or if it's just too difficult, you can just simply unmute yourself and say, hey, Ruby. But in the meantime, I'm going to read one from the chat, and then we'll go to Pamuela afterwards. And this is from Dennis Isaki. And a very important question: is the dune built above or below the certified shoreline, and at what elevation? And who wants to address that?
I can take a stab at that, but anybody on the team, please jump in. I mean, the certified shoreline is a jurisdictional boundary. So it isn't necessarily a geomorphic or a geologic representation. It does, the certified shoreline does represent sort of the highest wash of waves during a given year at the season of the highest wave activities. So I'd say in many cases, the dunes themselves exist landward or malka of the highest washes of waves. But there are times when the high wash of waves reaches into the dune. And it goes back to that very first slide that Wes showed, that showed the seasonal changes on a beach and how the dunes operate as our savings account to feed the beach during a high wave event. So during those highest wave events, those waves eat into that savings account and use that sand to dampen the waves and the wave energy at the shoreline. And then eventually the dune recovers again. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thanks, Tara. Does anyone have anything to add?
If I could just add to that, it is a good question. And I think it's an important question because we talk about this in the Dune manual, how a properly designed dune restoration project will most likely straddle the jurisdiction between the state and the county. More often than not, the certified shoreline would be somewhere close to the top of a dune crest, if there is a dune crest there or something similar to that. So it would probably straddle between the two, and that can complicate the permitting process, obviously, but that tells you that you're probably in the right location. You're not too far seaward, and I mean, it's okay to have a dune that's too far landward, but it may not be serving the intended purpose at that point.
Yeah, thank you, Dolan. We're going to move on to Kamuela, if you're ready to ask your question.
Yes, mahalo. My name is Kamuela Kalai, and I was wondering, what is the process to request somebody from your program to come and do a site visit to an area that myself and other community members have been very concerned for the last couple of years? The erosion is massive. There are iwi kupuna burials that have already tumbled out because of the wave action during the winter. They're buried right in where the coastline meets the roadway. So there's danger between the roadside already starting to crumble in and burials eroding and that kind of stuff. And so we have already contacted Department of Transportation and the OCCL, Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. And so they're working on an emergency permitting plan to try to stop the erosion. And I wish I had known about this program first, because I would have asked you folks to come and take a look at this to see if it's even possible to restore some of that sand dune, because it's at a critical stage now. If it keeps eroding, eventually the roadway is just going to crumble away, and it's getting so close to the traffic area. This is in Ka'ava, where the beach is just right up to the roadside. So I'm just wondering, I would love for somebody to just come and take a look at it and just let us know what the possibilities are of doing any kind of sand restorations, sand dune restoration in this area, as well as, if not possible in this area, in Kualoa, there's also Kualoa Park, massive erosion, trees falling in and all kinds of stuff. And there's also a lot of burials in those areas too. So how would I be able to, or would I be able to get somebody to just come do a site visit?
Yeah, Ruby, I can address that. Hi, Kamuela. It's nice to see you again. This is Amy. Brad Romine, our Sea Grant colleague, and I from Sea Grant were on that site visit with OCCL when we came up to Ka'ava a couple of weeks ago. So you've already engaged us without even knowing it. Unfortunately, I think the initial thought at that, there's so extreme erosion and so close to the road there. I don't know that dune restoration is something that will be possible, although we are looking at that and trying to think of a way to incorporate that in. But I am interested in talking with you further about Kualoa as well, where there's a lot of room there and is maybe a more likely scenario.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I remember you from the visit. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
We'll have you folks chat offline, but that's great, a great connection. And then you brought up a good point about how do folks contact us. And I know Wes probably went over this in the beginning, but worth to mention again that in the appendix, right, of the manual, and then here's a slide. You can also take a picture of the slide and email any one of us that is on your island. But there's also contacts in the manual itself. So,
Okay.
anything to add? You have
I
your hand.
did. Yes, I thought this is a perfect segue, knowing that we're close to time. It's a perfect segue to one of the chat questions from Larry Dill, which had to do with what makes a good candidate, a site, a good candidate for dune restoration, how resilient are restored dunes to large wave events. I think this example we just saw, the distinction between Ka'ava and Kualoa, is a great example of maybe Ka'ava is too far gone. There's not a lot of sand there to work with. There's a highway. For a number of different reasons, it might be really challenging to maintain a dune there. Whereas Kualoa has a totally different geology, and it's more sand rich. Even though it is eroding, there's sand available, lower elevation, not as steep. But one of the key distinctions I'd like to make here is Kualoa is really a public space. It's a park. It's very public, as opposed to in front of the highway, where it's kind of, you're getting the government easements and road easements, and gets more complicated. I think personally that the best suited locations for dune restoration are in fact in those public spaces, beach parks, where foot traffic erosion is a dominant form. And I don't know that's the case at Kualoa, but as an example, Sunset Beach being one of those among many, where there's just a huge number of people, you can counteract that with a well thought out dune restoration plan, as opposed to trying to combat coastal erosion due to waves and sea level rise and things like that. Can be successful, but much more challenging than, say, abating foot traffic erosion. I think that's where dune restoration can be extremely helpful.
Thank
So
you.
I just wanted to make that distinction, the kind of the public domain with foot traffic.
Exactly. And for folks that may not be familiar, the public domain also can be anywhere between the ocean and the high wash of the waves if you have a healthy beach there. So that's also public. So it doesn't have to be a beach park, although it may be more conducive to a restoration if it is already a park. Let's see. We had another
I can take the next question in the chat if you would like, Ruby.
Sure. Do you want to read it for everyone, just in case folks aren't reading?
Yes, this comes from the County of Maui, and the question is, what is a biological pedestrian survey, and who conducts it, and what are they looking for? And I know the question hidden behind the question here, and that is that dunes are often the home of some of our precious and often endangered seabirds, and of course habitat for other kinds of insects and other critters. So you saw at the beginning, Wes showed a sign when he was talking about habitat that it was identifying nesting habitat for the wedge-tailed shearwater. So one of the things we do need to think about anytime we're initiating a dune restoration project is whether there are shorebird nesting sites. And one way to evaluate that is to have an expert, and they're usually seabird experts at the state and sometimes locally on each island. They can come out and do like a walking survey and look for the signs of a bird nesting site. And then you can accommodate that in your plans in terms of timing.
Very cool. Thank you. Great question, Jim. Well, we are at the top of the hour. I want to give folks a chance if you need to get going. You got dinner planned, have you, Hahana? But I know we did cut short our Q&A, so we're happy to stay on for another 10 minutes if folks have further questions or just want to talk story and unmute, talk about their questions or problem areas. Stay on, standing by. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending this this meeting / webinar. The questions have made it all the more better. We will plan on sending out a follow-up email that has the recording. Perhaps we can stop the recording now, whoever has started it. And then we'll probably also send out the slides and the link to the manual again to anyone who registered. So mahalo.
I'll wait and find out if there are any more good discussion items before we stop the recording.
Oh.
Dennis, I was
Yeah.
hoping you would stay on. Yeah, because you had a good comment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd like a follow-up to my question as to the shoreline. You might think I'm a surveyor by asking this question.
Yes.
Yeah. I've seen in the past that when a wave overtops such a dune, and being that the definition of the shoreline is the highest wash of the waves is evidenced by, debris or something, that because the wave overtops it and it cannot go back down to the ocean, it slopes the other way, then that makes you actually lose, the property owner lose ground in defining the shoreline. And their building is based on the setback from there. So, you might have negative results on that.
Yes.
Just a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll respond just because you don't necessarily need a response, but there are some interesting situations out there. Like, as you're pointing out, sometimes the water flows over and then it gravity feeds sort of even further landward. I've seen that many, many times myself. And sometimes it's because, you have an extra high wave event, but other times it's because of the degradation of the dunes in the area. And so you might have like a small beach berm that is not backed by a well-developed dune like it should be. And if it were, if you had preserved it or you go back and restore it, it can, in some cases, prohibit that overtopping in future cases, in future swell events.
Well, another thing, we're kind of going against the previous policies of like no planting along the shoreline and no watering and stuff. So we're kind of going, counter to that now, right?
I just don't think that it was, I wouldn't say it's counter. I would say that there hasn't been as much outreach on the difference between like dune restoration and the benefits and what it can do versus actually planting the beach for purposes of extending your property line, which has happened in many cases. And then the state passed a law to prevent that from occurring. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, I don't think it's counter to any previous guidance, but perhaps there hasn't been enough outreach about dune restoration, which is what we're trying to address here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Dennis, and in the appendix of the guide, there's a very extensive part about the different dune plants and what to plant, and we almost included a what not to plant section, but we ended up not doing that. But yeah, a big difference being between like the puhui and the akiaki, the low growing frontal dune plants, and kind of the larger plants that are more appropriate as you move away from the ocean. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Great
Thanks
question.
for attending, Dennis. Any other questions? Comments?
There's another question in the chat. Thorne, do you want to unmute yourself and add your question?
Sure. Thank you very much. Great presentation, guys. Really appreciate it. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, great. So quick question, here on Maui, we do have a lot of streams that are plugged with sand. Occasionally, Public Works gives somebody a heads up to let them know that that's sand's available. If the stars align correctly, once in a while, we get to grab it and use it for small scale beach nourishment. On the other islands, is there any history or precedent set with agencies collaborating with any other agencies or Sea Grant that you know of so that we can replicate that success? Mahalo.
I will say that on Kauai, we had one where we collaborated, the county collaborated with the Department of Boating and Waterways when they dredged the canal in Kapa'a, the Waikaea Canal, I think it was. They dredged it twice and then transferred the sand to the county for beach nourishment purposes. Seems to require a very active, in this case, myself, extension agent, like actually, getting in touch, who's doing this and when, and there's not a system in place where, agencies are like, hey, we're about to dredge, hey, county, do you want the sand? It was more being very proactive and, basically knocking on doors, collaborative, et cetera, et cetera.
I'll just add also that specific to stream mouth clearing, different than like the maintenance dredging, most of those, their Army Corps permitting does also require them to place that sand adjacent on the beach in the same area there. So the sand should not be leaving the littoral cell when that stream clearing is done by the counties and doing that maintenance type of work. It should be remaining on that same beach, just outside of the stream mouth.
I just wanted to add to that. We had this very similar question this morning in our meeting, and one of us pointed out that we had an unsuccessful grant proposal to, in fact, develop guidance along these lines of, proper best management practices for stream mouth clearing. And what do you do with that sand? Which side of the mouth do you put it on? Those kind of questions, which, can't always answer every one, but the intention is for our Sea Grant program to work with partners on developing guidelines for how to best manage these stream mouths, because it's a very common, as you point out, Thorne, it's very common all over the Hawaiian Islands. They need to clear these stream mouths out to prevent upland flooding in many cases. And what you do with that sand is critically important over a period of years when it goes on so frequently.
All right.
Thank you. Mahalo. Amy, you mentioned that the Corps permits usually have that as a condition. Is there anyone at Corps that you recommend speaking to?
Yes. Christy Fluker is in the regulatory division there doing some of that regulatory permitting. And Linda Spearstra is the head of the regulatory permitting division there. Those are the two individuals who I know at the Corps.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Tim, yeah.
Yeah, hi Ruby. Hi everyone. Thanks you guys for all the good work and good to see everyone. A lot of names on the call that I don't know, which is good. And that's the reason why I want to bring this up is I'm here in Maui County, a shoreline planner. And Tara Owens has been our Sea Grant coastal process specialist, but all of a sudden another guy came into our life, Wesley Cryle, and he is, I don't know what his official, thank God for Wes, that's all I can say, but I think his official, I don't know his official title, but I call him a Dune Management Coordinator. I don't know, maybe a call on Tara to kind of reflect on not only has Maui County have one Sea Grant agent, but now they have two, and one is focused on our dune management. So it's really a success story in itself. I don't know if you have anything to add, or the process, or the
Well,
demand to, I mean,
I-
you couldn't do two jobs at once, I guess, right? So, yeah, I don't know, just.
Certainly tout Maui as very progressive in this area and leading the way. I mean, we didn't mention it, but Maui is still, I think, the only county in the state that actually has protections in our code for coastal dunes, which I think was a big kickstart for our, and a request from our community to start protecting our dunes, and what led to a lot of the dune restoration programs that got started here decades ago through volunteers. And it's been going on and on. It's gotten so popular and important to our community that we did end up needing a second person here to be able to manage many projects and many requests. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yes, thank you, Maui, for leading the way.
And somebody made a really good comment here about we'd like to know what not to plant. So maybe Wes put in some, he noted that some of the worst offenders are ironwoods, overgrown how, kiave, and overwatered naupaka. And then Jim mentioned, and this is true, that we tend to have there's a tendency of some private homeowners to plant natal plum, or is it called Carissa hedge, I think, which has the big thorns on it. And it's kind of used as a barrier, you know, between the private and public boundary, and it can be an offender as well.
It's like a living barbed wire fence.
But again, you can always reach out on your island to find out those kinds of stories and circumstances, and what to plant and what not to plant for the given circumstance.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight, it was difficult to give general guidance in a place like Hawaii, that, you know, it's never a one size fits all situation for dune restoration. So we were careful to, you know, we wanted to preface this is general guidance. It's a working document. We'd like to incorporate feedback, you know, from the field, from restoration practitioners that are doing these techniques, and really, you know, improve this document over time. So thank you all very much for.
Yeah, I would bring up one more question. Sorry, I was remiss.
Oh, yeah.
I received a question personally, and I guess on Kauai, every island has a unique situation. On Kauai, we get a lot of because of our watershed areas and our active streams, we get a lot of invasive albizia that's like transported down floods and then onto our beaches, which there was a comment from Dennis earlier about how he had observed some erosion effects on our Wailua beach, which is a very exposed beach on our east side. And I got the question about who's responsible for removing all that debris. And I hadn't brought it up yet because I personally don't actually, I think it is a bit of a gray area. But if someone else wants to chime in, or if they have that information, if it is indeed having the impact it has. Interestingly enough, on Wailua, it was a crazy scene with all the logs and trees kind of rolling around and causing erosion. And then the beach started recovering, and all those logs, all those trees just got covered in sand. So they're all now underneath the beach. But as we know, albizia is it's not a native tree, so it's not something that would happen naturally on our beaches. So any comments on that, I think, would be helpful for some in our audience, if anyone has anything additional. We might not know. It might be something we need to push for more answers from our leaders and decision makers, legislators.
I have a quick comment about that. So when I was in Kauai a couple of years ago, I saw all those huge logs just floating all over the place, rolling up on the beaches. And one of the suggestions from one of my friends was to he has a friend who's a carver, and he would love, if he had access and he could get to those logs, he could cut them up and take them with him, and I think there are a lot of carvers that would love to have access to it. So sometimes it's just putting the word out, because we could use that as a resource. Albizia is actually a really, when you finish it and you redo it, it's a beautiful wood. You just don't want it growing in the backyard. So that could be something that could just be taken up with, different community associations or members, or just community members, because he would have loved to be. He lives in Molokai, so that would be a problem. But there probably are carvers on Kauai that would love to just be able to, get a hold of those logs and use them.
Yeah.
Make something nice out of them. Beautiful.
Yeah, creative suggestion. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean,
Alright,
in terms,
well-
I could take a quick, in terms of cleaning the beach of debris, that I think there's definitely, it seems on Maui at least, there's a little confusion about like permitting or barriers to that. There's no reason that cleaning storm debris, like large trees or things like that off the beach, if they're posing a public hazard, that's perfectly allowable. I think it gets a little more complicated if you're digging up stumps or excavating, or then you get into kind of state historic preservation district issues and things like that. But if it's like you're describing, like giant trees that wash down the stream and they're rolling around, knocking out swimmers, that's totally reasonable to remove.
But is it the state or the county?
Yeah.
Or does it depend on the beach? Like if it's, some of our state beaches have actually been county managed through certain.
Executive order. Yeah, it depends who you're asking. I think the state would say it's the county. The county.
Yeah,
would say
there's
it's
a
the
lot
state.
of finger pointing.
If I may, several years ago, after the great big storm, the county Parks Department spent nearly $1 million in clearing up from Wailua Bridge to almost the Kamalani Playground. And then, they had
I remember that.
gigantic logs, like 8 feet diameter and stuff moved. A subsequent storm brought down a little bit more, but they get some kind of big logs that I've mentioned that kind of acts like almost like a seawall or something that might affect the surrounding erosion. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah.
Yeah, County Maui Public Works did, this is Jim, County Maui Public Works at some point after our December 4-5 big south side Haleakala watershed dump on all of our beaches. It was, I think, almost a month before they got to some of the highly populated beaches to clear out all the debris. They did.
Sorry.
Yeah, right. But so I'm glad Amy's still on. Maybe we need, and everyone, maybe we need a beach debris clearing response plan, right? Maybe get a little hooey together, because it's a good question, right? Finger pointing. So if we actually coordinate it, we could figure it out. And it's probably different for different areas, right? As we go around the islands, and what's priority what isn't priority. But I swam before work this morning, and with the big south swell coming in, there's choked debris still in close from that December 4-5 storm that we had. I saw rolling around out there. So it's good to get it off the beach, obviously. So maybe some sort of a coordinated response plan would be a good offshoot of this meeting here. So Not that anybody needs more work. Every meeting equals what? Every meeting equals more work, right? So,
Yeah, well, I know we're way over time, but I really appreciate the discussion and having these great minds on this call. Or this Zoom, I still use the word call. So I think I will
okay.
stop the recording, or whoever was recording.